Hi everyone and welcome to my channel. Today I have 21 of my favorite Easter DIYs that I've done so far here on my channel. Keep in mind while you're watching that since this is a combination of a lot of the projects that they are labeled a little bit out of order. I really hope that you enjoyed today's video. Now let's go ahead and jump right into it. The first DIY today, I'm making a bunny tabletop picture. And for this one, I'm using one of these unfinished wood bunnies that come in the bunny garland pack from Dollar Tree. And I'm only going to be using one bunny today. And I'm using some of my wood filler to fill in the hole that's in the top of the bunny's ear. I let that sit for a while to completely dry. And then I just moved on and started staining this chalkboard tabletop sign from Dollar Tree. And I'm using my Craft Smart wood stain in the color brown. And I just used an old towel to apply it. And I only did one coat of this stain. And all of the little areas where it was kind of hard for me to get the stain with just my rag, I ended up using a small paintbrush just to paint the stain in there, and then used my towel to wipe the excess stain off. And I did stain the front and the back side of this sign, and I am going to be using the back side of the sign for my project today. Then I'm using my Waverly chalk paint in the color Ivory, and I painted that onto what's going to be the back side of my sign, and I ended up doing 2 coats of this paint. The first coat I did really globby, and I did not let it dry all the way because I wanted the back surface of my sign to have a really rustic vintage look. So the second coat that I did, I just did that really messy too and left the paint a little bit globby because when I add another color onto it, it's going to give me the vintage look. While those 2 coats of paint were drying, I decided to dry brush some of that Waverly paint in the color Ivory around all of the edges on my stained wood. I kind of wish I would have just left it stained, but once I painted over it, I couldn't go back. So it is what it is, and it just has more of a rustic look, I guess. Now that the ivory color is all dry, I took a small fluffy paintbrush and I used my Folk Art chalk paint in the color Castle, and I dry brushed this color over top of all of the ivory. Now, since I painted the ivory color on really messily and left it kind of globby in between my coats, anywhere where I'm painting this Castle color over top, it's going to give me that really vintage distressed look that I want. Then, since I really didn't care for the ivory color over top of my stain, I ended up taking some more of that Castle colored chalk paint and painting that over top of some of the ivory around all of the edges that are stained. Now that the wood filler on my bunny is all dry, I used some sandpaper to sand off all of the excess wood filler and to give my bunny a nice smooth surface for painting. The paint that I'm using is the Folk Art chalk paint in the color Sage. I love this color so much. It has the perfect amount of blue and green, and it's great for Easter. Once my bunny was all dry, I used some of this striped ribbon to tie around the bunny's neck, and I made a really simple bow, and then for the ends of my ribbon, I did cut those in a diagonal. For the last step, I used hot glue on the back side of my bunny to attach it in the middle of my tabletop sign. And this is the bunny picture all finished. It was such an easy project, and it's the perfect accent piece to add to any tabletop or shelf. Now for DIY number 2, I'm making a carrot wreath. For this project, I'm using one of Dollar Tree's 12-inch willow wreaths and then some of these decorative carrots. They come 6 in a pack, but I'm only using 5 of them today. I started by just hot gluing all of the carrots onto my willow wreath. I did not place them going all in the same direction. I thought they looked better randomly placed on my wreath. But once I had all 5 of them on my wreath, then I started adding some more detail. I used some of these boxwood stems. These ones are from Walmart, but Dollar Tree has some really great options for greenery, and the ones I'm using from Walmart are super cheap. And I'm also using some of this Spanish moss, and I started by just cutting it in really small pieces so that it was easier to hot glue onto my wreath. And I just hot glued the Spanish moss around all of the carrots and just continued that step until I had it all the way around my wreath. If you guys have ever worked with Spanish moss, and then you know that it can make a project look really messy, I always like to go through and cut the Spanish moss down with some scissors just to make it look a little bit more neat and put together. Now that I have the Spanish moss added and cut down, I'm then going to be adding some of those boxwoods that I showed you earlier. And I like to cut these down as well in pretty small pieces because they're easier to work with and I can place them exactly where I want them. I'm just placing them on top of the Spanish moss in between some of those vines in the willow wreath and around my carrots. I'm placing hot glue right onto the wreath and then just placing the boxwoods on the glue to attach them. Again, I just continued this step until I had the boxwoods going all the way around the wreath. Next, I'm using some of this burlap ribbon. This is going to be the hanger for my wreath. I'm cutting that into a strip, and then I'm cutting that strip in half. Since my wreath is only 12 inches, I thought it would look a little bit better to have a thinner ribbon at the very top. I then wrapped that ribbon around the very top of my wreath, and it did end up being a little bit too long, so I did have to trim it down just a little bit, and then I hot glued the two strips of that ribbon together. I wanted to add a little bit more detail to my wreath, so I'm using this striped ribbon and I'm making a really simple bow. I love this ribbon so much. I'm so glad I'm finally able to find it at Dollar Tree. It is definitely my new favorite go-to ribbon, and for the tail ends of this ribbon, I did end up cutting them in a diagonal. For the last step in this project, I hot glued that bow right in the center of my burlap ribbon. And here's the carrot wreath all finished. It is so cute and so simple, and what's even better is it only took me a few minutes to create. Moving into DIY number 3, I'm making decorative eggs and a pedestal tray. For this one, I'm using one of these small little mini trays, and I'm staining it with my Craftsmart wood stain in the color brown, and to apply the stain, I'm using an old towel. But when I got to the inside of the tray, where the areas were a little bit harder to reach with my rag, I used a small paintbrush to put the stain right in those corners, and then I just used my rag to wipe away the excess stain, and I did stain the entire tray. I'm also using 4 of these little finials or like decorative legs. These ones are from Walmart. They do not have these at Dollar Tree, so you could always just opt out and just have the tray sitting on its own without the legs. But I'm painting all 4 of mine with my Waverly chalk paint in the color ivory, and I only did a 1 coat of this paint on all 4 of the legs. After the paint was all dry, I then hot glued all 4 of my legs on each side of the bottom of my tray. Next, I'm going to be creating the decorative eggs that are going to go inside of my tray. I'm using a 6-pack of these speckled eggs, and 2 of them I'm painting with my Folk Art chalk paint in the color Sage. And I did 2 coats of paint on the eggs that I'm painting with the sage color, and I did use the end of a paintbrush to place inside of the hole that's in the bottom of the egg to make it a little bit easier for me to paint the entire egg without it rolling around. I then painted 2 more of the eggs with my Folk Art chalk paint in the color Castle, and I did 2 coats on these eggs as well. And then for the last 2 eggs that came in the pack, I painted those with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Ivory, and I did 2 coats on these as well. I know that some of the eggs already come white, but I wanted to get rid of the speckles that were on the eggs. After the paint was all dry, I'm then gonna be decorating my eggs. For the 2 white color ones, I'm using this really pretty jute ribbon that Dollar Tree now carries. I measured it around the very top of my egg and then just cut it down to size, and I'm hot gluing the 2 ends of that ribbon on the bottom of my egg. I'm doing the same thing to add another piece of this ribbon going across the other side of the top. Just measured that down to size once again and hot glued the 2 ends of that on the bottom side of the egg. And I was gonna leave the egg just like this, but I decided to add another strip of this ribbon going around the middle of the egg. Again, just measured that down to size and then hot glued the 2 ends of the ribbon around my egg. Next, I'm decorating the 2 eggs that I painted the castle color. I'm using this striped ribbon that I think goes perfect with this color. I'm using the ribbon to wrap around my egg just to measure it down to size, and then I'm hot gluing that piece of ribbon around my egg. And it's really cute just like this, but I did want to add a little bit more detail. So I used some jute and I made a really simple bow, and then that bow I just hot glued onto the center of my striped ribbon. To decorate the 2 eggs that I painted the sage color, I'm going to be using some of this cotton lace ribbon. I just measured it to go around the center of my egg and then hot glued the 2 ends of the ribbon around the egg. And then I thought it would be really cute to add one of these tiny little buttons to the front of it. Now that my eggs are all decorated, I can start placing them into my tray, but I did want to add some of the Spanish moss inside of my tray, and then I also cut down some pieces of raffia and placed those on top of the Spanish moss just to give it more of like a nest look. And then I placed all 6 of my decorated eggs on top of the Spanish moss and raffia. To add one little more detail to my tray, I'm using one of these rectangle unfinished wood pieces that comes in the value pack of wood that you can now get at Dollar Tree, and I'm painting that with my Waverly paint in the color Ivory. Once the paint was dry, I then stamped on the word spring. I am still kind of new at using stamps, and I'm not the greatest at getting them all lined up, but my word ended up looking a little bit more vintage, and I'm happy with how it turned out. Then for the last step, I hot glued that small piece of wood that now says spring right on the front of my tray. Here is my pedestal tray and my decorative eggs all finished. This one turned out so good, and I just love all of these colors paired together. It definitely gives some farmhouse vibes. Now for the 4th and final DIY today, I'm creating a moss bunny. For this one, I'm using one of these styrofoam craft bunnies, and I'm also using some reindeer moss. I like this reindeer moss a little bit better than any of the other mosses at Dollar Tree. I just think it is a little bit nicer and looks a little bit better. Well, I'm taking the moss and I'm just pulling it apart so that I can work with it in a little bit smaller pieces. I then started placing hot glue right onto my bunny and then pressing the moss on the glue to attach the moss to my bunny. And I just repeated that same step over and over until I had my entire bunny covered with this reindeer moss. It does look really messy and not in the shape of a bunny at all, but trust me, it will later on. As you can see here, it looks just like a big blob of moss, but this is where I start taking my scissors and giving the bunny a little bit of a trim. I cut down the moss as much as I possibly can, all the way down to the styrofoam bunny, and then anywhere where I had like little bald spots, once I gave my bunny a trim, I just reapplied the Spanish moss with some more hot glue, and I just kept doing that step over and over until my bunny was completely covered in the moss, and then it was trimmed completely down. Once I had it all covered in the moss, I thought it would be really cute to add some of this striped ribbon, which you guys have seen me use in pretty much every one of today's projects because I love it so much. I just took the ribbon, I tied it around the bunny's neck, and just created a really simple bow. And then for the tail ends of my ribbon, I just cut those in a diagonal because that's my favorite. And here's my bunny all finished. This was by far the easiest project in today's video, and I think it turned out really cute. For DIY number 1, I'm making a moss topiary. And for this one, I'm using a 3-inch terracotta pot from Dollar Tree. And I started by painting that with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Ivory. I painted the entire pot this color, and I only did 1 coat of paint. Once that paint was dry, I then took some sandpaper and I just started roughing up that paint a little bit to give me a nice distressed look. Once I had my pot all finished, I then moved on and started attaching this reindeer moss from Dollar Tree to a 3-inch foam ball. To attach the moss, I used some hot glue. I just placed the glue right onto the foam ball and then pressed the moss on top of that to attach it. And I continued this step over and over again until I had my ball completely covered in the moss. It does look really messy, but I did end up using my scissors to trim down that reindeer moss and give my ball its shape back. Next, I'm taking this dowel rod and I'm pressing it into the bottom of my moss ball. Once I had it in my ball, I decided I wanted it to have a stained look. So I then used my Craftsmart wood stain on an old rag and I just applied that to the entire dowel rod. Now I'm wrapping some of this Easter themed berry garland around my entire ball. I just randomly wrapped it around in different places until I thought it looked good. Once I had it all the way wrapped around, I just cut off the end, and then that end wire piece, I just looped through another one of the wire pieces that was already on the ball just to hold everything into place. I did pick this garland up at Hobby Lobby. It was $2.99, and then I think it was like 40% off of that. Next, I'm cutting down some of this floral foam that I picked up from Dollar Tree. I did have to cut it down into a few different pieces to get it to fit exactly the way I wanted it to into the bottom of my pot. I then placed my dowel rod right in the center of that floral foam, and I thought it would be really cute to add some Spanish moss to the very top of my pot. And I just attached it using some hot glue, put the hot glue at the very top of the floral foam and then pressed the moss on top of that. And I did give it a little bit of a trim as well. For the last step in this project, I'm adding some jute on the underneath lip of the top of my pot. I wrapped the jute around a few times, I would probably say like 4 or 5 times, and then I cut off the end and hot glued that to secure it. And this is my moss topiary all finished. I think it turned out super cute. It was a really easy and affordable project, and I really love the pastel colors of this berry garland. Now for DIY number 2, I'm making a Hello Easter sign. For this one, I'm using 3 of these unfinished oval wood shapes. These ones were 4 3/4 by 7 inches, and I did pick them up at Michael's. 2 of them I'm painting with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Ivory, and I only did 1 coat of paint on 2 of them, and I did paint around all of the edges of them as well. Then for the 3rd oval shape, I'm painting that one with my Folk Art chalk paint in the color Sage. I love this color so much. It is great for Easter, or I guess pretty much any time, but I really love it for Easter. I painted a 1 coat on this one as well, and all 3 of the oval shapes were 99 cents a piece. After the paint was all dry, I'm then taking my Folk Art chalk paint in the color Castle on a small fluffy brush, and I'm dry brushing that onto both of the oval shapes that I have painted the ivory color. You can't really see it here, but this is giving it a more like distressed, rustic look. My lighting was a little bit too bright here, so sorry about that. And then for the sage color oval, I'm dry brushing that with the ivory color. It's now time to assemble everything together. I'm taking the sage colored oval and I'm placing hot glue on the back side of it, and then I'm pressing that one onto the 2 ivory colored ovals. In this project, I'm also using this unfinished wood word cutout that says hello, and I'm painting it with my Waverly paint in the color Ivory. I did pick this one up from Hobby Lobby, and it came in a pack of a bunch of different words, and some of them were hello, family, grateful, blessed, and a couple other ones as well. And then I'm using these individual wood letters. These ones I think are either from Hobby Lobby or Michael's. They were just in a stash with a bunch of wood letters that I had, and I'm spelling out the word Easter, and I'm also painting them all with the Waverly paint in Ivory. Once the paint was all dry, I'm then using hot glue on the back of my wood hello word, and then just placing that right in the center of my sage oval. And then before I hot glue my letters that say Easter, I did put them below the word hello, and I just wanted to have them all spaced out before I started gluing them down, because once you glue it down, it's really hard to get it off if you're not, or if you don't have them spaced exactly the way you want them to. So I always like to set the individual letters down first before hot gluing them on. Now I'm using this burlap ribbon from Dollar Tree, and I'm cutting it down so that the edges of the ribbon will go along the oval shape. And then once I have the 2 edges cut of the ribbon, I'm also cutting the ribbon to be a little bit thinner as well. I'm then attaching that piece of ribbon right underneath my word Easter using some hot glue. For this project, I thought it would be really cute to add some of these spring florals that I picked up from Hobby Lobby. I really loved the green color on these and how cute the little white flower is, but before I started attaching them, I had to cut them down just a little bit so that it would be easier to place onto my sign. I'm attaching the little flowers right over top of the burlap, and I used hot glue on the stem of each flower and then just pressed that down onto the burlap. I did have to hold each flower down until the glue was completely set to make sure that they stayed in place. After I had all of my flowers attached, I decided to add some Spanish moss to all of the stems of my flowers, and I used hot glue to attach it, and I thought it just added a really cute touch to my sign. And then to add one more little detail, I decided to add a small bow at the very top of the sign right above the word hello, and I used this really cute striped ribbon from Dollar Tree. I just made a little bow, and then for the tail ends of the ribbon, I just cut those in a diagonal shape and then hot glued that bow right on the top of my sign. To create the hanger for my sign, I'm using some nautical rope. I just measured that to the length that I wanted my hanger to be, cut that down to size with the world's dullest scissors. Since this video, I have purchased a good pair of scissors, but these ones had definitely seen better days, so it took me forever to get through this rope. But once I had it all cut, I then flipped my sign over, and to attach the rope, I used my staple gun. And here is my Hello Easter sign all finished. I ended up putting mine in the center of a wreath. I love all of the neutral colors on this. It can go with pretty much any decor. For DIY number 3, I'm making hop blocks, and for this one I'm using 3 different size and shaped blocks. These did come in a unfinished like wood block pack from Hobby Lobby, and I just picked out 3 of them that I thought would be good. And I'm painting all of them with my folk art chalk paint in the color Sage. You guys know I love this color so much, and I only did 1 coat of paint on all of the blocks. Once those were sitting and drying, I'm using the letter H and P. These letters, I believe, are from Hobby Lobby. Again, I just picked them out of my pack of letters that I have just randomly in my craft stash, and I'm painting that with the Waverly paint in the color Ivory, both for the letter H and P. Next, I'm using this Easter themed berry garland that I picked up from Hobby Lobby, and I'm wrapping it around 2 of my fingers about 3 or 4 times to form a wreath. This is going to be the O for my word hop. I'm then placing hot glue along the back side of the wreath and then putting that in the center of the block that I'm using for the middle. I'm then attaching my letter H to the front of one of my blocks and then attaching the letter P to the front of one of my blocks. Next, I'm using this burlap ribbon from Dollar Tree, and I'm cutting it a few inches in length, and then I'm cutting that strip in the shape of a bunny ear. After I had my first ear cut out, I then needed to cut out a second ear. So I did the same thing, just cut a few inches of a burlap, but now I was able to use my first ear as a guide to help me cut out my second ear so that both of them would be the same size. To add some detail to my ears, I'm using some of this white trim that has like these little pom-poms on them, and I'm hot gluing that around all of the edges of both of my ears. I did pick this up at the Target dollar spot last year around Valentine's Day, but I know that a lot of craft stores have trim and ribbon very similar to this one. For the very last step for this project, I'm just using some hot glue on the bottom sides of both of my ears and then hot gluing those on the very top of my block that has the letter H on it. And here are my hop blocks all finished. This project only took me a few minutes to create. I think it turned out super cute, and it's perfect for any tabletop or shelf decor. Now for the 4th and final DIY today, I'm making potted bunny ears. For this one, I'm using a 3-inch terracotta pot from Dollar Tree, and I'm painting it with the Waverly chalk paint in the color Ivory, and I did paint my entire pot this color. Once the ivory color was dry, I'm then taking my folk art chalk paint in the color Castle on a small fluffy brush, and I'm dry brushing that color on my entire pot, and I'm going all in the same direction to give it a rustic look. Next, I'm cutting down some of this floral foam from Dollar Tree. I did have to cut it down a few different times so that it was the right size to place into my pot. I'm also using some of these bunny ears napkin holder from Hobby Lobby, and it did have a tag attached to the back, and I was able to just tear that off really slowly, and it was fine. It didn't damage the ears. And then I didn't want to have it completely in a circle, so I just used some scissors to cut the very bottom of the napkin holder, and then I placed that into my pot around my floral foam. For this project, I'm using some boxwood stems from Walmart. This whole bundle, I believe, was only $1.47, which is a great price, and I cut them down quite a bit so that I could place them around my bunny ears without them being too overpowering. And I just placed some hot glue right onto the floral foam and then pressed the boxwood stem on top of that to hold them into place. I continued this step until I had the boxwoods around the entire floral pot, going all the way around all of my bunny ears. Next, I'm using some of these mini eggs. They did come on a floral pick from Michael's. They are $1.99, and then I got 40% off of that pick, so really inexpensive. I just cut the little eggs off of the stem and then placed those into my floral pot around all of the boxwood stems. And for the eggs that didn't have an actual stem left on it to place into the floral foam, I just hot glued those right onto the boxwoods. To add just a little bit more detail to my pot, I'm using some of this jute ribbon from Dollar Tree. I'm measuring it around the bottom portion of my pot and then just cutting that down to size and hot gluing it around my pot. And here are my potted bunny ears all finished. Again, such an easy project that goes with pretty much any kind of decor. For the first DIY, I'll be making a decorative bunny tag, and for this project I used this tag-shaped Christmas ornament that I still had left over from Christmas time, and I had picked it up at Dollar General. I also used a silhouette bunny that I printed from my computer, Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster, folk art chalk paint in the color Sage, paintbrushes, my hot glue gun, jute, scissors, burlap ribbon from Dollar Tree, buffalo check ribbon from Hobby Lobby, and lilac stems from Michael's. I first started by cutting the hanger off of this tag and then flipping it over. I'm going to be using the back side of this tag for this project, and I painted it with my folk art chalk paint in the color Sage, and I did do 2 coats of this paint to make sure that everything was covered up nicely. Next, I cut the excess paper around from my bunny silhouette so that it would be easier for me to place in the center of my tag. I then flipped the piece of paper with my bunny over and then took a piece of chalk and drew that chalk along the back side of the bunny. This is going to help me transfer that bunny onto my tag. I'm then placing the bunny exactly where I want him to be on the front of my tag, and then taking a pen and outlining around the entire bunny so that that chalk on the back side will transfer onto the front of my tag. Once I'm done outlining the bunny, I'm then peeling off the paper and then taking my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster and a really small tipped paintbrush and painting that color around the entire inside of that bunny silhouette. And I did do 2 coats of paint on top of my bunny. Now I'm making a really simple bow with my buffalo check ribbon that I picked up from Hobby Lobby, and then I'm cutting the tail ends of the ribbon into a diagonal shape. Once I have that made, I'm then cutting down some burlap ribbon from Dollar Tree. I wanted this to be a little bit thinner, so I'm just cutting off both ends of the ribbon, and then I wanted to attach it above my bunny right at the top of my tag. To do that, I'm using some hot glue on the back side of the tag and then just wrapping the 2 tail ends of the ribbon along the back side. Next, I'm pulling off some of this greenery from these lilac stems that I picked up from Hobby Lobby. I had originally already put on my bow right in the center of that burlap but didn't like it, so I just pulled it off and then I'm putting that greenery right in the spot where I had attached that bow. I'm then placing some more hot glue on top of the greenery and then just reattaching that burlap bow that I had originally had in that spot. For the last step in this project, I'm stringing a piece of jute through the already pre-drilled hole and then just tying the end of that off in a knot. Here is my decorative Easter bunny tag all complete. This project was so easy to do and is the perfect Easter decor craft. Now for DIY number 2, I'll be making a framed bird's nest. For this project, I used a 5x7 frame from Dollar Tree, floral craft paper from Hobby Lobby, decorative bird's nest from Hobby Lobby, folk art chalk paint in the color Spanish Moss, Waverly chalk paint in Plaster, paintbrushes, my hot glue gun, jute, scissors, Spanish moss, and mini speckled eggs. For this project, I started out by taking my entire frame apart, and I had originally painted my frame in this like white and brown rustic looking color, but I didn't really like the way that it was looking, so I just went ahead and painted over that. And to paint over it, I used my folk art chalk paint in the color Spanish moss, and I did do 2 coats of this paint just to make sure that everything that I had already painted on was completely covered up. Once that color was completely dry, I then took my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster, and I very lightly dry brushed this around the entire frame. Once I had that color on, I wanted to add a little bit of this truffle color from Waverly Inspirations, and I just very lightly dry brushed that around the frame as well. Next, I used the glass part of the frame as a guide to help me trace out the size for my floral craft paper. Once I had that all traced, then I just used some scissors to cut out the paper. Now I'm attaching that floral paper onto the cardboard part of my frame. I just placed the hot glue right on the cardboard and then placed my paper over top. I really wish I would have used Mod Podge for this because my paper would have sat a lot flatter, but I didn't, and there's no going back after you've already glued it on. I'm then putting my entire frame completely back together. I'm then placing some hot glue right on the front of that floral paper, and I'm going to be attaching one of these mini bird's nests to that spot. I'm holding the nest into place until the glue completely dries, and then I'm attaching another nest sitting halfway up on the other one that I just attached, and I'm just attaching that using some hot glue and making sure I hold that into place until all of the glue has dried. I wanted to add some Spanish moss to the insides of my nest, so here to attach the Spanish moss, I'm placing hot glue on the inside of the nest and then just sticking the Spanish moss on top of the glue. Next, I'm adding some of these mini speckled eggs right on top of the Spanish moss inside of the nest. I'm just using hot glue once again to attach all of the eggs, and I did 2 eggs per nest. You could leave this picture just like this, but I decided I wanted to add some jute. So here I'm taking 2 strands of jute and I'm tying a knot on each end of those strands. And I was going to have this as like a hanging picture. So originally I glued both of those knots on each side of the top of the frame as my hanger, but then I decided I didn't really want that, so I left the one side on and then just did those 2 strands going along the top of the frame, and then just made another knot and just re-hot glued that knot on the other side where I originally had the other knot, only this time I just made it as the strands going across the top instead of a hanger. Here are my framed bird's nest all finished. I really love all of the colors on this project. They just springtime to me, and I'm really happy with how this project turned out. And now for the third and final DIY for today, I'll be making decorative Easter eggs. And for this project, I used a pack of paper mache eggs from Hobby Lobby, matte Mod Podge, burlap fabric, ticking fabric from Hobby Lobby, cream color fabric from Hobby Lobby, my hot glue gun, jute, scissors, raffia, and a paintbrush. For this project, I started by cutting my burlap fabric into about 1/2 inch thick strips, and I did a bunch of different strips, and I ended up only using these strips on 2 of my eggs, so I believe I used between 6 and 8 strips, and then I cut those strips down in half so that they would wrap around my egg and not be too long. Once I had those cut, then I moved on to cutting my striped or ticking fabric that I picked up from Hobby Lobby, and I cut these strips in the same size, about 1/2 inch to 1 inch thick. Some of them were a little bit bigger than other, but I originally started with 1/2 inch and ended up with some of them a little bit bigger than that. And then I did the same thing. I just cut those down to the size that they would fit to wrap around my eggs, and then I did the same thing for this cream color fabric as well. To help all of my strips of fabric sit flat onto my eggs, I'm cutting the ends of my fabric into a triangle shape or a point so that I don't have any bulky fabric at the top and the bottom part of my egg. Once I have all of my fabric cut, I'm then taking a paintbrush and painting on this matte Mod Podge right onto my paper mache egg, and then taking a strip of my fabric and placing it on top of the glue, and then just using my finger to press down the fabric on top of the glue and make sure that there's no bubbles. And then continuing that same step, only this time I'm using some of that Mod Podge on half of the fabric that I've already placed down onto the egg, because I'm overlapping each strip of fabric as I'm placing it onto the egg. And for this one, I'm rotating or switching up between the burlap fabric, the cream color fabric, and then that striped fabric. So I'm just continuing these same steps of painting on the Mod Podge onto my egg and half of the fabric that's applied onto my egg, and then just pressing down the fabric with my finger onto the glue, and then just continuing that same step, like I said, switching up the fabric as I go until it's completely covered in my egg. And then I'm taking a piece of this raffia and I'm tying it around the middle of my egg, and then just making a bow and cutting off the excess raffia. I'm adding just a tiny bit of hot glue right underneath the raffia bow to hold it into place. I also did 2 other eggs, kind of in a different style than the ones that I just did, but I did do the same steps as I did on the other eggs. I used the Mod Podge, and then I just used the cream color and the striped fabric on these 2, and I switched up between those 2 fabrics around the entire egg. And then for this one, I tied a piece of jute around the center of the egg and made a very small bow, cut off the excess jute, and then used a little bit of hot glue underneath that bow to hold it into place. These are my decorative eggs all finished. These scream farmhouse style to me, and they really go with the decor that I have in my home currently. For DIY number 1, I'll be making a mini egg wreath, and for this project I used Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster, Folk Art chalk paint in Persian Gray and also in the color Java, paintbrushes, 12 large popsicle sticks from Dollar Tree, a 3-inch embroidery hoop, 3 mini decorative eggs, buffalo check ribbon from Hobby Lobby, jute, Spanish moss from Dollar Tree, and my hot glue gun. I started by painting all 12 of my popsicle sticks with my chalk paint in the color Persian Gray. I made sure to paint both sides of the sticks, and I only had to do 1 coat of paint. Next, I took apart my embroidery hoop, and I'm only going to be using the inner circle for this project. Once I had it out, I then painted it with my Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster, and I only did 1 coat of this paint as well. Now I'm assembling all of my popsicle sticks. I'm doing 4 across and 4 down. I'm putting hot glue on the 2 ends of 1 popsicle stick. I'm then placing it onto 2 of the outer popsicle sticks and letting that dry. I'm then flipping that section over that I just glued together, and then I'm going to be gluing 2 more popsicle sticks right in the center of the 2 outer sticks that I just attached, and I'm leaving a space in between all of the sticks. I'm flipping it over once again and then attaching 3 more sticks right onto the front side, leaving a space in between, and this is going to start to give me that woven look. To finish this part of the project, I'm attaching 4 more popsicle sticks along the front side, only this time I'm placing them over top of the first sticks that I attached. Because I wanted this piece to have a more rustic look, I decided to use some Java colored paint, and I dry brushed that over top of this entire piece. I then painted 3 of these mini speckled eggs, which I believe are either from Walmart or Hobby Lobby from last year, and I painted them with that plastered color chalk paint, and I only did 1 coat of paint on these. Now I'm attaching my embroidery hoop to my popsicle sticks. I'm placing the hot glue only on the part of the embroidery hoop where it will be sitting on the sticks. I'm then centering the hoop in the middle and then just pressing it down to attach it. Next, I'm putting hot glue on the inner bottom part of my embroidery hoop and then placing Spanish moss over top of that. This is going to be what appears to look like a bird's nest. I'm then putting hot glue on the bottom of all 3 of my painted eggs and then placing them on top of that Spanish moss that I just attached. I'm using a piece of this buffalo check ribbon to make a really simple bow. I'm then cutting the ends of the ribbon in a diagonal shape, and to attach the bow I'm using some hot glue and I'm attaching it right in the top center of my embroidery hoop. Now I'm making a hanger. I'm using 2 strands of jute and I'm tying a knot on the ends of both of those strands of jute. I'm then flipping over my popsicle stick piece and I'm attaching the jute on the 2 end popsicle sticks, and to attach it I just use a little bit of hot glue. Here is my mini egg wreath piece all finished. It was so simple to make and goes perfect with any farmhouse decor. Now for DIY number 2, I'll be making fabric carrots. For these, I used cream color fabric from Hobby Lobby, also striped fabric from Hobby Lobby, greenery stems from Hobby Lobby, lilac stems also from Hobby Lobby, polyfill stuffing, scissors, jute, and my hot glue gun. I first started by measuring and cutting out all of my fabric into squares, and I did do a few different sizes because I wanted a few different size carrots. I did 9" by 9", 7" by 7", and a 5" by 5". Once I have all of my fabric cut, I'm then folding my squares in half, and now I'm going to be making my carrot shape, so I'm going to be cutting my folded square in a diagonal. I've opened up my fabric to this triangle shape, and now I'm placing hot glue right on one side of that fabric and then just folding it in half once again to attach the other side of the fabric together to form a seam. Now you could always stitch this together or use fabric glue, but I'm just using my trusty old hot glue gun. Once all of that glue has dried, I'm then flipping this fabric piece inside out, and to help me out a little bit, since there is a point to this, I'm using an end of a paintbrush or one of those little dowel rods, and it really helped me be able to get the point all flipped out. Next, I'm using this polyfill to fill my fabric and form my carrot. You can get polyfill at any local craft store or Walmart, Amazon, but I'm not going to be filling my fabric carrot all the way to the top. I'm going to be leaving a little bit of that fabric open. Next, I'm taking a piece of jute and I'm tying a knot around the very top, leaving about 1 inch or so of that fabric showing. And I'm not tying that jute completely tight because I'm going to be adding some of these greenery leaves and grass from those stems that I had picked up from Hobby Lobby. After I have all the greenery added to the very top of my carrot, I'm then just tying that jute really tight and then cutting off the long ends. Here are my fabric carrots all finished. They were so affordable and easy to make. I did multiple sizes in these, again the 9 by 9, 7 by 7, and 5 by 5, and for the striped ones I did vertical stripes and also horizontal stripes. Moving into DIY number 3, I'll be making standing decorative eggs. For this project, I used a pack of these wooden eggs from Hobby Lobby, Waverly chalk paint and plaster, Folk Art chalk paint and Java, paintbrushes, burlap fabric from Hobby Lobby, raffia, jute, scissors, lace ribbon from Dollar Tree, buffalo check ribbon from Hobby Lobby, buttons from Dollar Tree, and my hot glue gun. I started by painting both of these wooden eggs with my chalk paint in the color plaster. I did have to do 2 coats of this paint to get all of that wood color covered up, and then I also painted the very bottom part of the egg as well. To give both of the eggs a rustic farmhouse look, I dry brushed my Java colored chalk paint over top of both eggs and then just dabbed that color over the eggs as well. For the first egg, I'm cutting a piece of burlap fabric about 1 inch thick, and then cutting that down to size around the center of my egg. After I have my fabric all cut down, I'm then hot gluing both ends of my burlap fabric around the back side of my egg. Next, I'm measuring and cutting down to size this lace ribbon to go around the very center of my egg, just like the burlap fabric. I'm then hot gluing this lace ribbon right over top of the burlap fabric. Then for the piece of jute, I'm doing the exact same thing. I'm wrapping it around the center of my egg and then cutting it down to size, and then just hot gluing it right over top of that burlap and lace fabric. For the finishing touches on this egg, I'm hot gluing 3 buttons on the front right over top of the fabric and jute. I'm doing a darker colored button that's a little bit larger in the center, and then I'm doing 2 smaller cream color buttons on the sides of the larger button. For the second egg, I'm attaching some of this buffalo check ribbon to the very bottom of the egg with some hot glue. I'm then wrapping the ribbon around the top of the egg and bringing the other end of that ribbon and just attaching it on the bottom as well. I'm then taking 2 more pieces of this buffalo check ribbon and continuing that same step, leaving a small space in between the ribbon. And for the last step on this egg, I'm using a few strands of raffia, and to attach them, I used some hot glue along the back side of the egg, and then on the front side of the egg, I'm tying a really simple bow and then just cutting off the extra long ends of the raffia. To make sure my bow stays in place, I'm using some hot glue right underneath it. Once again, these eggs were so easy and affordable to make and hardly took me any time at all to create them. And now for DIY number 4, I'll be making an Easter sign. For this project, I used an unfinished sign from Dollar Tree, Waverly chalk paint and plaster, folk art chalk paint in sage and also in the color Persian gray, paintbrushes, jute, scissors, an inkjet printer, a piece of printer paper, tape, and shipping labels. For this project, I started by painting this unfinished wood piece that I picked up from Dollar Tree with my Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster. I did have to do 2 coats of this paint. While that was drying, I took my shipping label and I peeled off the back sticky part of it and discarded it. I'm not going to be using that part for this. And now for that leftover piece that I have, I'm using the shiny side up and I'm placing it in the center of my piece of printer paper and then using some Scotch tape and taping that onto my printer paper. After I have this all taped onto my piece of printer paper, I'm then placing that paper into my inkjet printer. And for this, I'm going to be making my transfer that's going to be going onto my wood, which I've created on my computer, and I'll have it linked down in the description box. After I have that all printed, I'm cutting it down so that it's easier to place and center onto my piece of wood. Next, I'm centering my image onto my wood piece and then using an old gift card to press the ink from the image onto the wood. This is kind of the same as doing the wax transfer method, but instead I'm using the shipping label paper. And then to go over the image a little bit more, I'm using the end of a paintbrush just to press that ink down into the wood even more. And for this, since the paper was kind of curling up, I really had to hold it into place since I didn't tape it into place. So just keep that in mind. You don't want your paper to move at all because it will smudge the ink. Once I have the ink all pressed into the wood, I'm simply just peeling that piece of paper off. And then I wanted to add a little bit of distressing to the wood, which I kind of wish I would have done in the beginning before I did the transfer, but I didn't. So here I'm just adding some of this sage chalk paint and then also some Persian gray chalk paint to this piece, and then just used a really small brush to do around the letters of the words. Here is my Easter sign all finished. I love how rustic and vintage it looks. For DIY number 1, I'll be making a bunny shadow box picture. And for this project, I used this Easter sign from Dollar Tree. I also used this Easter ornament from Joann Fabrics, Waverly chalk paint in plaster, folk art chalk paint in Persian gray, paintbrushes, pussy willow stems from Michaels, my hot glue gun, jute, scissors, and wooden beads from Dollar Tree. I started by taking the sawtooth hanger off of this sign using some scissors, and I am going to be using the back side of this sign for this project. I then went in with my Persian gray chalk paint and I painted the entire inside of this sign with that color, and I did have to do 2 coats of this paint. Next, I painted all 4 sides of my sign with my plaster colored chalk paint, and since the sides were already white, I only had to do 1 coat of paint, and then around the front edge I did 2 coats of paint since those were more of a brown color. I then painted this wooden bunny ornament cutout with that same plaster color chalk paint. Next, I painted these wooden beads from Dollar Tree with that same plaster color paint once again. I put them on a piece of jute and then just taped that over top of a crate so they would be easier to paint. I really wish I would have had a spray paint to do this, or I would have already had white wooden beads. This was kind of a nightmare, so I would highly recommend spraying them or just buying beads already painted. Once the beads were completely dry, I then strung them onto a new piece of jute that didn't have paint all over it, and then in between each bead I'm tying a knot. So I would put a bead on, tie a knot, put another bead on, tie another knot, and I did that until I had 6 beads strung on my piece of jute. I then took my strung beads and wrapped them around the front edge of my sign. I took the end pieces of the jute and wrapped them around the back side of the sign and hot glued them down. Then to attach my wooden bunny cutout, I placed hot glue along the back side and then just centered it in the middle of my sign and pressed it down. I decided I wanted to add a few of these pussy willow stems, so here I'm just pulling a few of the stems off so that they're easier to attach on around my wooden circle. I placed hot glue right on the stem and then I'm just pressing that down around the circle to fully attach them, and I continue that step until I had them wrapped all the way around the circle. And here is my bunny shadow box picture all complete. This was such an easy and affordable project, and I just love the simplicity of it. Now moving on to DIY number 2, I'll be making a Happy Easter sign. And for this project, I'll be using this welcome sign from Dollar Tree, this Happy Easter wooden cutout from Joann Fabrics, a 6-inch grapevine wreath, Waverly chalk paint in plaster and also in the color ink, folk art chalk paint in Castle, paintbrushes, decorative carrots from Michaels, black and white ribbon from Walmart, mini decorative eggs, scissors, my hot glue gun, jute, and Spanish moss from Dollar Tree. For this project, I'm using the back of this Dollar Tree sign once again, and I needed to take off the staples and ribbon that were attached to the sign, so I started by using a butter knife and then realized I could just pull them right out. So once I have them all off, I took a piece of sandpaper and just sanded down any of those rough edges so that I have a nice smooth surface. I then painted both of the boards that came on the sign with my plaster color chalk paint, and I did have to do 2 coats of paint to get them fully covered. Once the paint was completely dry, I then took my Dollar Tree stencil brush and my Castle color chalk paint, and I dry brushed this color onto both boards. I did use a little bit more paint than I normally would when dry brushing, and for the areas that I have more paint, I just pressed down on my brush a little bit harder. I wanted my boards to have a really distressed look. Next, I'm flipping my boards over, and now I'm attaching them together. To attach them together, I'm using 5 different popsicle sticks. These are the larger ones that you can get from Dollar Tree, and I'm putting hot glue right onto the popsicle stick and then pressing it down onto the board right in the center so that they are attached together. For my Happy Easter wooden cutout, I painted it in my chalk paint in the color ink, and I only had to do 1 coat of this paint. Now I'm wrapping this black and white ribbon around the very top of my grapevine wreath, and I'm leaving the ribbon long enough so that the grapevine wreath sits right in the middle of my sign. And then to hold my ribbon into place, I'm hot gluing the ends of the ribbon on the back side of the sign, and then I'm hot gluing the ribbon down on the front of the sign as well. I really love using Spanish moss in my Easter and spring decor, so here I'm attaching some of this moss that I picked up from Dollar Tree in a few different spots on the front of my grapevine wreath, and then in the spaces between the moss I'm adding some of these mini carrots that I picked up from Michaels, and I used 4 carrots on the front of this wreath. And then I'm adding 3 mini speckled eggs in between my carrots, and I believe these ones are from Walmart last year, but you can get mini speckled eggs like this pretty much at any local craft store. Next, I'm attaching my Happy Easter wooden cutout. I'm placing hot glue right on the back side and then placing it right in the center of my grapevine wreath. For the last step, I'm making a hanger for my sign. I'm taking 2 pieces of jute and I'm making a knot on both ends of that piece of jute. I'm then hot gluing the 2 knots on the very front of my sign. And this is my Happy Easter sign all finished. Again, super easy and inexpensive to make. And I actually had most of these materials at home. The only extra thing I had to pick up was this Happy Easter wooden cutout. And now for the last and third DIY for today, I'll be making an egg-shaped welcome sign. For this one, I used this egg-shaped sign from Dollar Tree, this metal welcome word from Dollar Tree, Waverly chalk paint in Plaster and also in Truffle, Folk Art chalk paint in Glacier, paintbrushes, Spanish moss, painter's tape, jute, scissors, and my hot glue gun. And no surprise here, I'm going to be using the back side of this sign from Dollar Tree, and I started by painting it with my plaster colored chalk paint, and I did have to paint on 2 different coats of paint. Once that paint has completely dried, I'm then making stripes on the front of my sign. I'm putting a piece of painter's tape right in the center, and then I'm using a second piece of tape next to that as my spacer between my stripes. I'm then placing a third piece of tape next to the spacer and then peeling the spacer piece off. I'm continuing those same steps until I have all of the stripes made on the front of my sign. Next, I'm painting my chalk paint in the color Glacier in all of the spaces between my painter's tape, and I only did 1 coat of paint for this. Once that was completely dried, I peeled off all of the tape. Now I'm going to start to create the checked pattern on the front of my sign. To do that, I'm placing a piece of painter's tape going horizontally right in the middle of my sign, then placing a piece of painter's tape right underneath that, and that one's going to be my spacer piece, then placing another piece of painter's tape underneath the spacer piece, then peeling off the spacer piece of tape. I'm then continuing those same steps until I have all of my stripes made going horizontally on the front of my sign. I'm then painting that same color Glacier that I used before right in between all of the spaces between the tape. Then once that paint has all dried, I'm then leaving all of that painter's tape on and then taking new pieces of tape and placing them over the same lines that I had originally made in the beginning. You'll be able to see those lines underneath the paint from before, so you can just place the tape right over top of those same lines. In the spaces between all of the painter's tape, I'm then using my chalk paint in the color Castle, and I'm only painting on 1 coat of this paint. Once all of that paint has dried, I'm then peeling off all of the painter's tape, and now I've created a buffalo check pattern. I wanted to add a little bit of a rustic look to this sign, so I'm taking my Dollar Tree stencil brush and my chalk paint in the color Truffle, and I'm dry brushing that color around all of the edges of the sign, and then also dry brushing that along the front of the sign, but I am keeping my brush strokes all going in a vertical direction. Next, I'm measuring and cutting down to size this burlap ribbon from Dollar Tree. I'm wrapping it around the front center of the sign and then taking the 2 ends of the ribbon and just hot gluing those along the back side of the sign. I'm then hot gluing this metal welcome word that I picked up from Dollar Tree in the center of that burlap ribbon. I was going to do welcome spring, but I ended up liking just the way that the welcome word looked. Now I'm making a really simple bow out of some raffia that I also picked up from Dollar Tree, and I'm cutting that down a little bit and then just hot gluing that on the front top part of my sign. I was going to leave my sign just like this, but then decided to add some Spanish moss around the raffia bow, and to attach it I just placed the hot glue right on the front of the sign and then pressed the Spanish moss over top, and I think it ended up looking kind of like a bird's nest, and I really liked the way that it looked. For the last step, I'm adding a hanger to my sign. I'm placing a piece of jute through the pre-drilled hole that was in the sign and then just tying that off. Here is my egg-shaped welcome sign all finished. This one, except for the paint, was all Dollar Tree materials, so super inexpensive. For the first DIY, I'll be making an Easter egg wreath, and for this project I used 2 packs of these speckled eggs from Dollar Tree, a 10-inch wreath form, Spanish moss, reindeer moss, Waverly chalk paint in the color Plaster, Folk Art chalk paint in Java, Sage, and also in the color Castle, paintbrushes, an old crafting toothbrush, raffia, jute, scissors, and my hot glue gun. I first started by painting 4 of these speckled eggs with my Castle color chalk paint, and to speed up the painting process a little bit, I would paint half of the egg with this color, and then I used my hair dryer to dry that paint. I couldn't really set the eggs down since they are an odd shape. I would then paint the other side of the egg and then use my hair dryer to dry that, and I did do 2 coats of paint for this. And then I painted 4 more of these speckled eggs with my sage colored chalk paint, and I did the exact same steps as I did with the castle colored ones. I'd paint half of the egg, dry it with my hair dryer, paint the other half of the egg, dry it again, and then I did 4 more eggs in my plaster colored chalk paint the exact same way. And I did 2 coats of paint for all of my eggs. Once I had all of my eggs painted, I then went in with this old toothbrush that I use for crafting and my Java colored chalk paint, and I just dabbed that paint over all of the eggs to give them a nice speckled look. Next, I'm starting to assemble my wreath. I'm placing hot glue right on my wreath form and then placing one of my painted eggs over top of the glue to attach it. And then I'm continuing this step all the way around my wreath, and I'm spacing the eggs out enough that I can fit all 12 of them around the wreath form. After I have all of my eggs attached to my wreath form, I'm then placing hot glue on the sides of the wreath form and then sticking the Spanish moss right on top of the glue to fully attach it. And I'm continuing this step over and over again. And then in between the eggs, I'm putting hot glue right on the wreath form once again, but this time I'm placing the reindeer moss on top of it. So I'll have the Spanish moss going around the entire sides of the wreath form, and then between all of the eggs and around the eggs, I'm doing the hot glue and then placing the reindeer moss over top of that. I'm continuing those same steps until I have all of the sides of my wreath form filled with moss and then in between all of my eggs. Then I'm flipping over my wreath and then I'm filling all of the empty spaces that are on my wreath form with some Spanish moss. Once I have the back filled up, I'm then flipping it back over, and then any of the open spaces on the inner circle around all of the eggs, I'm just filling those in with the leftover reindeer moss that I have. Once I have all of my moss on, I'm then using some scissors to trim up around my entire wreath so that it looks a little bit more neat. You could leave your wreath just like this, but I wanted to add some raffia. So here I'm taking a few strands of the raffia and I'm tying it around the back side of my wreath to hold it into place. I'm then wrapping it around the front of my wreath in between the eggs. And I am doing this so the raffia sits loosely in between the eggs. And since my raffia pieces were kind of short, I just had to glue the ends of it down along the back side and then start a new piece. I continued that same step until I had the raffia wrapped around my eggs for my entire wreath. And I wrapped it around every few eggs, not every egg, and I really liked the way that it looked. For the final step, I'm making a hanger for my wreath. I'm taking 4 pieces of jute and I'm tying them around the top of my wreath, going between 2 of the eggs, just tying a knot for the length that I want my hanger, and then just cutting off the excess jute. Here is my Easter egg wreath all finished. This project was so inexpensive to do, and I think this looks just as good, if not better, than the wreaths that you would find in a retail store. Now moving on to DIY number 2, an Easter chalkboard. For this project, I used an 11 by 14 inch frame, a 4-pack of these carrots, Rust-Oleum chalkboard paint, Waverly chalk paint in the color plaster, bulk art chalk paint in Java, paintbrushes, jute, a chalkboard marker, scissors, and my hot glue gun. For this project, I started by taking my entire frame apart. Once I got the glass piece out, I then took it outside and I sprayed it with my Rust-Oleum chalkboard paint. I did 2 really good coats on this, and I did let the coats dry in between. I waited probably about 15 to 20 minutes in between coats. I then painted my frame with my plaster color chalk paint, and I did have to do 2 coats of this paint. Once that paint was completely dry, I then went in with my Java colored chalk paint and my Dollar Tree stencil brush, and I dry brushed that paint right over top of my frame to give it a nice distressed look. And then after everything was dry, my chalkboard and my frame, I put everything back together. And then I'm gonna start assembling my garland to go on the top of my frame. I'm using the 4-pack of these like jute wrapped carrots that I got from Dollar Tree. I'm taking a piece of jute and I'm wrapping it around the very top of the carrot and then just tying a little knot to hold it into place. And then to make sure that everything stays nice and secure, I'm adding a little bit of hot glue at the very top. I'm then continuing those same steps when attaching the next 3 carrots to the strand of jute, and I did space the carrots out a few inches in between each carrot. After I have all of my carrots attached to my strand of jute, I'm then taking my garland and wrapping it around the very top of my frame to see how long I want it to be draped around the top. And then I'm just taking the ends of the jute and hot gluing them along the back side of the frame to hold everything into place. And for the last step, I'm writing the words Happy Easter, and I did end up drawing a little Easter egg on the side as well, but you could always do any kind of design or words that you want. Here is my Easter chalkboard all finished. Again, this was such an easy and inexpensive project, and it really didn't take much time to complete at all. And now for DIY number 3, a Happy Easter sign. For this project, I used 2 vertical love signs from Dollar Tree, wooden bunny ornaments, wood letters that spell out Happy Easter, Waverly chalk paint in plaster and also in ink, folk art chalk paint in the color Java and in Castle, paintbrushes, jute, sandpaper, wood filler, raffia, my hot glue gun, scissors, and 5 large popsicle sticks. For this one, I started by cutting off the fabric hangers that were on these signs and then just removed them. I then went in with my wood filler and filled in those holes. I'm just placing the wood filler on my finger and then pressing it into the holes, and I am using the back sides of these signs for this project. After the wood filler was completely dry, I then went in with some sandpaper and sanded on those areas and got any of that extra wood filler off until the areas were completely smooth. I also filled in the holes that were in the top of my bunny ornaments, and then once that wood filler was completely dry, I went in with my sandpaper once again and just sanded away any of the extra wood filler until those areas were completely smooth. Next, I painted all 3 of my wooden bunnies with my plaster color chalk paint, and I did have to do 2 coats of this paint, and I also made sure to paint around all of the edges of the ornaments as well. Now back to my vertical signs. I'm attaching both of them together. I'm laying 5 large popsicle sticks on the back and then just hot gluing the sticks onto the signs in the center so that it holds the 2 together. And I'm just continuing this step until I have all 5 popsicle sticks attached to the 2 signs. I'm now using my measuring tape to mark off what would be in the center of each sign, which was at 3 inches. I'm then taking a piece of painter's tape and I'm just putting that right on the 3-inch mark on the top part of the sign and then on the bottom part of the sign. I'm then using my measuring tape once again to mark off half of the 3-inch mark, which would be at 1.5. So I did 1.5 at the top and then 1.5 going from the bottom. I'm then laying a piece of painter's tape right at the very top of that 1.5 mark at the very top of my sign and then at the very bottom of my sign. In between my 2 top pieces of tape, I'm painting on my chalk paint in the color Sage. I'm then painting the same color Sage underneath the second piece of painter's tape. And in between my 2 bottom pieces of tape, I'm also painting that same color Sage on in between them. Once that paint has dried, I'm then peeling off the tape and I'm reusing some of the tape. I'm taking the piece that you see here and then I'm just moving it up a little bit because I'm going to be making some new strips to paint a second color on. I'm continuing to peel off the pieces of tape and then just moving the ones that I can reuse up a little bit or down a little bit to make new lines for the new colors that I'm going to be painting on. The strips of tape that I had peeled off, I just put over top of the sage color that I had already painted on just to kind of protect it. And I was making 2 new strips so that I could paint this castle color that you see me painting on right now. I did a strip on the top and then a strip on the bottom part. Once that was dry, I just peeled off all of my tape. Once again, I'm using more tape. I'm just covering up the areas that I've already painted on because I don't want to accidentally paint a new color on over top of an old color. So this is just to protect my strips that I've already made. I'm now painting on my plaster color chalk paint on the top strip, a middle strip, and then the bottom strips that are left over that I haven't painted yet. Once I have that paint on, then I'm just going to peel off the painter's tape after it's all dry. But I did realize after painting it on that I don't really have a pattern with my paint colors. I was supposed to do, or I was wanting to do, like the white color, the sage, and then castle, and then continue that same pattern, and I mixed them up somehow, so oh well, it still looks fine to me. Next, I'm going in with my Java colored chalk paint and my Dollar Tree stencil brush, and I'm dry brushing this color around all of the edges of my sign, and then I'm also taking it on the flat front part of my sign as well, just to give it a distressed look. I'm then dry brushing my plaster color chalk paint on the darker colors on the sign. And here I am with some more tape. I'm placing a piece of painter's tape right on the lines between my colors, and then just placing another piece of tape right above that, and I'm leaving a very small space in between. I wanted to have a line of black going between each one of my colors. So to do that, I just made a little line. You could just draw one on yourself, but I was afraid that my line wasn't going to be straight. So originally I did the Sharpie marker in between, but I didn't really like how that looked. So for the next few pieces that I did, I just put the tape on, left a small space in between the tape, and then I used my chalk paint in the color ink and then just painted the line right on. And after that paint had completely dried, I just peeled the tape right off. Then to add a little bit more distressing, I took some more of that ink colored chalk paint and I dry brushed that over top of my entire sign. And then I took my plaster colored chalk paint once again and I dry brushed a little bit more on top of the front of my sign over top of all of those black lines that I just painted on. Next, I'm painting all of my wood letters that spell out Happy Easter with my ink colored chalk paint, and I only had to do one coat of this paint when painting them on my letters. Once the paint has completely dried, I'm then placing my words on the front of my sign and just arranging them how I want them before I start gluing them down. To glue the letters down, I'm placing hot glue right on the back of the letter and then just pressing them down right into place. And I'm continuing this step until I have both words Happy Easter glued down onto my sign. For my wooden bunnies, I'm taking a double piece of jute and I'm tying it around the neck of the bunny and then just making a small bow. I'm then using some hot glue right underneath the bow to hold everything into place. Next, I'm taking 5 strands of jute and I'm wrapping them around the front side of my sign, and then I'm just hot gluing the ends of those 5 pieces of jute down along the back side of my sign on both sides. I'm continuing that same step with the 5 strands of jute onto the other side of my sign, doing the exact same thing. I was going to leave the sign just like this, but I decided to add a raffia bow. So I'm taking some strands of raffia and just making a really simple bow, and then just cutting off the long ends. Then to attach the bow, I'm placing hot glue right in the center above the words Happy Easter and attaching the bow. And for the last step, I'm making a hanger for my sign. I'm using 5 strands of jute and I've tied off a knot on both ends. And I've already pre-measured how long I want these strands of jute to be for my hanger. And then I'm taking some hot glue, placing it on both sides of the sign, and then just pressing both ends of the jute onto the glue to attach it. And this is my Happy Easter sign all finished. I really love how this one turned out, even though I messed up a little bit on my paint color pattern. And that wraps it up for all 21 of my favorite Easter DIYs. I really hope that you enjoyed today's video. If you did, please be sure to give it a thumbs up. If you're not subscribed, I hope that you will consider subscribing. And as always, I would love to hear which project from today's video was your favorite. Thank you so much for watching.